this final week of Module 2, we're looking at aging and immunity, and we're really talking about where aging stands as far as the body's defense mechanisms, and looking at the immunity aging theory and seeing how that relates to the changes that we see as far as the immune system. And so at the end of this lecture, we should have a good understanding and be able to describe the immunological aging theory. We should also be able to differentiate between the two branches of the immune system, that is the innate or natural immunity, and then the acquired immunity. And then finally, we should be able to list some of the physical changes to the innate and the acquired system that occur with age. Now, human immunity is a really complex function. It's a lot of different organ systems working together to prevent infection, to prevent disease. And so we're going to talk about the physiology that is responsible for the immune system and talk about how the body works to prevent itself from harmful invasion of bacteria, pathogens, as well as to some degree from physical intrusion, such as the skin being a protective barrier from injury. And then we'll also talk about some of the functional changes that happen in the immune system and how those start to decline with aging. So we can see the complexity of the immune system in this image, right? There are all types of body systems and body functions that are contributing here. We've got our mucous membranes that have things like lysozymes that are protecting us against bacteria. We've got our tonsils that are these lymphatic aggregates in various parts of the oral cavity, nasal cavity, nasopharynx, that are also preventing bacteria and viruses from attacking the body. We've got lymphatic vessels throughout the body. We've got the thymus, the skin, again, one of the biggest and most important organs as far as the first line of defense. So lots of different systems playing a role here and contributing to the body's defense. Now, this brings us to speaking about the immunological aging theory. And so a lot of research conducted throughout history has suggested that there's a strong correlation between aging and a decline in the immune function of the body, a decline in the body's ability to protect itself from invasion, from pathogens, from disease, from infection. This is called the immunological aging theory. We know historically that there's a connection between mortality rates and infectious diseases. We talked about this when we looked at longevity in Module 1. And so there's a clear link between being able to prevent disease, prevent infection, and increasing in mortality, not only on an individual basis, but on a widespread level as well. And so the percentage of people who are over age 65 that are protected by vaccinations is usually half of what we see in younger populations. So again, pointing to the fact that even while vaccinated, adults over 65 have a weaker ability to defend themselves, even under vaccination. And so there's a clear compromise in the immune system that happens with age. And so these theorists, the immunological aging theorists, believe that this is not by mistake. This is not a coincidence. There is just a common set of symptoms that are seen with chronic disease that are really coming about as a result of the decline in function of the aging, of the immune system that happens with age. And so to kind of delve into the theory a little bit more here, we can look at the overall function of the immune system. So there are two branches to the immune system. There's the innate or natural immunity, and then there's the acquired or adaptive immunity. So we'll start with the innate immunity. This is the body's first line of defense. This is what we're born with. This is how we protect ourselves, prevent infection. This is including barriers against infection physically, like the skin that I mentioned, like the mucous lining of our body cavities, like the acidity of the stomach. And so this is the body's kind of initial, I like to think of this as being defense against these pathogens, against things that can cause disease, etc. So if you have a foreign substance, such as a bacteria or a virus, the innate system can also attack that, right? There's phagocytosis, which can engulf those particles and destroy them. And so phagocytosis is another important function of the innate immunity. It's the ability of some of our cells, such as neutrophils and macrophages, to engulf foreign substances, which we call pathogens, bacteria and viruses, fungi as well. And so the cells can engulf those particles and destroy them. And this process is called phagocytosis. So this is one way in which we can kind of fragment those pathogens. If it's bacteria, fragment them into smaller pieces and simply prevent our systems from the invasion of these pathogens. We've also got other cells that can help in this process. These are called dendritic cells, and these are going to be more involved in the acquired immunity. And so again, looking here at the innate immunity, this is really our body's defense. I like to think about innate versus acquired immunity as defense versus offense. So the body can have these standard mechanisms that protect itself. If you think about an injury to a blood vessel, there are certain clotting factors, things like histamines and prostaglandins that can make their way to the site of the injury and can increase the inflammatory response, which is another part of that built-in immunity. So anything that the body has in terms of its design or does or produces that can protect itself from injury, from invasion, is what we call the innate immunity. So here's a really good example. So we have an injury to the dermis of the skin, the epidermis, as well as the underlying capillaries. And so we can get the invasion of bacteria coming in. And so the initial response of the body is to produce an inflammatory response by aggregating our immune cells, such as macrophages and neutrophils, that acquire or accumulate at the site and can begin to engulf and break down the bacteria that's at the site of injury. And here they're playing a really important role in preventing invasion, okay? While we have bacteria throughout our body, there's bacteria that live on our skin and live in other cavities. They're usually different types of bacteria. And so when there's any break in the skin, there is an opportunity for, let's say, bacteria that would normally live on the skin to now inhabit our vessels, to travel in the blood, or to just invade the site of injury. So we really want to have cells like the neutrophils and macrophages preventing against this type of invasion. And so now we can look at the acquired immunity as an extension of the innate immunity. So let's say the defense or the innate immunity, the defensive immunity, was not able to stave off or to prevent invasion of bacteria or pathogens. Now we call on the second branch of the immune system, which is the acquired, or what we can sometimes refer to as the adaptive immunity. And we'll talk about why it's called adaptive here in a second. So this is where the cells of the acquired immunity, things like our lymphocytes, which include T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, or T cells and B cells, these can now begin to offensively attack that pathogen. So this is another reason why I like to refer to this concept as defense versus offense, because if you're not good at protecting yourself from kind of a passive standpoint and you are invaded, now you've got to actively defend yourself or actively attack those pathogens because they've now breached your initial defense system. And so this is where these lymphocytes come into play. They work with things that we call antigens. And so antigens are parts of the pathogen that can be eliminated. So that anything that's threatening to our immune system that can be picked up as foreign or pathogenic. And so the B cells and T cells work to destroy these pathogens as the initial immune response. But they also do a couple things in the long term. The B cells, more importantly, are going to stick around with this antigen. They're going to create memory about this invasion or about this pathogen. And so they're going to show or represent on their surface receptors that are specific to the antigens that were eliminated. And so in the case of a future attack by a similar antigen or the same antigen, so let's say another attack of a similar bacteria happened in the future, then the memory cells or the B cells here can quickly reproduce themselves in order to attack the antigen in future if it is encountered again. And so this is what we mean by the adaptive immunity. So this branch of the immune system is not only working kind of in an offensive way to attack pathogens, but it's picking up information about the existing threats, the existing bacteria or viruses. It's remembering it for future use, and it's able to quickly attack these pathogens if they are encountered in future, or if there's a subsequent or second exposure. Now let's talk about how these systems change with age. And so because of the findings that we're going to discuss now, this is the basis for the immunological aging theory. Some of the changes that we're talking about are signs that the immune system declines with function. And so this is the basis for explaining that possibly the cause of aging is the decline in function of the immune system. So when the body is no longer able to protect itself, either again, through innate immunity or through acquired immunity, and so it loses the ability to stave off infections or disease, then we can see the consequences of that, which lead us to chronic disease, aging, and eventually death. And so the first thing that we see as far as the innate immune system is that there's a decline in the phagocytic ability of our neutrophils and macrophages. And so right away, we can see a huge gap or a huge susceptibility to threat if our macrophages and neutrophils are no longer able to engulf, to first of all, get to the site quickly enough, engulf pathogens and particles quickly enough, and to prevent invasion by these pathogens, then we already have a compromised immune system, and we already are going to see things like delayed wound healing and increased inflammatory responses as a result of this decline in phagocytic ability of our neutrophils and macrophages. And so to look more closely here, we can see that neutrophils, for example, show a change in the circulating number. They're slower in terms of actually aggregating at the site from the bone marrow. They also have a decrease in their ability to phagocytose effectively, and a decrease in their ability to conduct chemotaxis. And chemotaxis is essentially the toxic attack on pathogens, on bacteria, by substances that are stored within these neutrophils. So essentially their ability to perform their functions essentially are affected. And so this opens up the body to infection. As far as macrophages, there's no change in the existing or circulating number, but there is a decrease in its phagocytic ability. There's also a decrease in cytokine and chemokine production. Again, cytokines and chemokines are going to be chemical messengers and signaling molecules that help to attack those pathogens as well. So both of these age-related changes are opening up or making the body more susceptible to foreign attacks, to infection, and just to overall disease. As far as changes to the acquired or the adaptive immune system, we see the production of naive T cells, and naive T cells are fresh, new T cells that have just been instructed from the thymus. So these are really high in their concentration right after puberty, right in early adulthood, when the thymus is still actively functioning and still educating, so to speak, our brand new T cells. There's also a decline in the production of B cells, as well as the effectiveness of antibodies, right? Antibodies are the memory, if you will, molecules that help to fight off antigens at the moment, but also provide that memory for later on if that antigen is encountered again. So we see all of these factors of the acquired immune system decrease. The thymus gland, we know, is also completely atrophied at this point. It becomes really small, or involutes is what we call that change. And so because of this, we don't have new T cells being produced or being educated in the thymus. So this ability to refresh or to create more new T cells doesn't happen as we age as effectively as it does in early adulthood and even around puberty. And so being able to mount an appropriate immune response just gets worse and worse with age. There's also a decrease in the circulating T cells. They also function below their optimal level, so they're not as effective in their functioning. So not only do we decrease the numbers, but the ones that are existing aren't as effective in their function. And so this explains why even vaccinated older individuals are still likely to acquire diseases and are still less protected than vaccinated younger persons or persons in younger populations. And so because of the weakening of the immune response, because of the ineffective action of the antibodies and the antigen-antibody system, not only are we more susceptible to invaders with age, but we're also not likely to remember existing pathogens and be able to attack them as effectively if we encounter them in future. So essentially, all facets of the innate immune system are affected, and facets of the acquired immune system are also equally affected. And let's look at this image here. It shows a decline in the strength of the immune system with age. And just comparing from infancy all the way up to elderlyhood or in late stages of life, we can see that, for example, the influenza, so when the influenza went on a rise, the cases were highest in young populations as well as in older populations. So these are our immune compromised, so to speak, groups of the population, the infants and adults, old adults in the elderly stage. And so what I really like to point out here is that if we look at the deaths per 100 of persons during this time period, we'll see that during the pandemic itself, right, these two susceptible populations had the highest rate of death. But then we also see this rise during that influenza pandemic. But if we look at the seasonal flu, which is kind of the normal flu, which shouldn't really affect healthy populations, we also see a slight rise in the deaths during infancy, and then the same exact curve for the deaths during adult stages or adulthood, or elderly stages rather. And so what this tells us is that the immune system or the rate of death that we see during a pandemic is the same rate of death that we'll see during a traditional seasonal influenza attack. And so it really speaks to the decline in immune function that happens with age. Even in infancy, which is our other susceptible population, the curve differs as far as deaths in the pandemic or due to the influenza pandemic versus deaths that are just due to the traditional influenza or the seasonal flu. If we can compare these events at the top to the graph at the bottom, which really talks about the strength of the immune response and some of the players that are involved, we can see that maternal antibodies start rising during infancy. We've also got B and innate cells. We've also got T cells that are rising around infancy, also during pregnancy. So during pregnancy, the mother also has kind of a heightened immune response as a protective measure for herself and baby. And so we see that completely drop off by the age of mid-70s or so. So the only thing that kind of sticks around is some of our T cell function, but other T cells, the B cell antibodies, all of those factors that contribute to a strong, vigorous immune response really drop off significantly beyond the age of 70. And so this brings us to speaking about this idea of immunosenescence. And immunosenescence is the age-associated dysfunction of the immune system that occurs as a natural part of the aging process. So there isn't any disease as such that's causing this. So there are immune diseases that could be responsible for a decline in the immune function, but this is not that. This is just purely a progressive deterioration in the body's ability to respond to infections, to mount a vigorous immune response, and to protect the body from invasion against pathogens, bacteria, etc. And so this is going to be also connected to the relative life expectancy. Remember that the immune system is going to be a protective function, and as it declines, so will mortality increase. And so immunosenescence can sometimes happen as a result of unavoidable exposure to a lot of various antigens, such as various bacteria and viruses. Now, kind of in summary here, let's talk about kind of the overall theme of how aging and immunity are tied. So first off, we've got a healthy immune system, which peaks at around puberty. Beyond that period, it steadily and progressively begins to decline. And we talked about some of the actual changes that we see. For example, neutrophils, macrophages lose their phagocytic ability, T cells, B cells, antibodies decline in their number, also lose their ability to mount an effective response. And so we see that steady decline happening beyond the age of puberty. We also see a functional loss in the innate immune system. So contributed to by the cells that I just mentioned, again, neutrophils and macrophages. We see atrophy of the thymus. So the thymus is the gland that's responsible for producing new T cells and instructing them. That is no longer located in the chest area. So the thymus is typically posterior to the sternum, and that is no longer actively there. It completely involutes or atrophies. And so that instruction of new T cells is not available. And then we see this increased susceptibility or vulnerability to disease, to infection, to chronic disorders, and to death. Common infections are more severe and they take a longer time for older individuals to get over. So things like a common cold, where someone who's young and healthy may get over a cold easily without much therapeutic intervention necessary. In elderly individuals, that's not so, right? A simple common cold or a simple infection can be detrimental, can even be fatal. And this is because of this diminishing or this decline in the immune function. We also see an increased incidence of autoimmune disorders in older individuals. So just other types of dysfunction in the immune system. So for example, instances where the immune system starts to attack itself, things like myasthenia gravis, where the immune system begins to attack certain elements of the neuromuscular junction. So we see a lot of these autoimmune disorders where the body's attacking itself, prevalent in elderlyhood or in older adults as well. And I kind of want to make a connection here between what we're seeing as far as the decline in the function of the immune system and kind of what's happening now with this pandemic and with COVID-19. We're really working to protect our elderly population from this virus because, as I mentioned earlier, someone who's young and healthy in their 20s to 30s may not be as susceptible to the consequences of the coronavirus, but someone who's well into their 60s, 70s, 80s, this can be the meaning between life and death. This can be fatal. It can be fatal more quickly. And even if it's not fatal, it's just going to be a harder hill to climb in terms of the recovery times, the recovery efforts, and the therapeutics that are required to treat the disease in older populations. So just some connection to what we're actually seeing live on the ground, and as far as the pandemic goes, as far as this virus goes. And so I want you to be thinking about that and other relevant ideas and thoughts and experiences, maybe examples that you have in your personal life, as you reflect on the questions this week and share your contributions in the discussion.